Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Adapting Jewish Literature, Yentl and a Tale of Love and Darkness. Today's program, which is being recorded, is a collaboration between Moment Magazine and Rewind, the Shenson Retrospective Film Series, which is a project of Stanford's Toby Center for Jewish Studies. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Today's program is scheduled for approximately 75 minutes. Following today's program, please visit Moment's website where you can subscribe to the magazine and be sure to register for next week's Zoominar, Charoset from Around the World and Other Passover Specialties with Chef Vered Gutman. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Shayna Hammerman, Associate Director of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford University, as she will introduce the rest of today's program. Shayna?
Thank you, Suzanne, for that introduction. And thank you especially to Moment Magazine for co-sponsoring this event with us today for our Rewind retrospective film series. Today, each of our panelists will offer a brief presentation, followed by a moderated discussion, and finally a Q&A with you, our audience. So whenever you have a question or comment, we encourage you to type it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address as many questions as we can today. Before we launch into it, a few introductions. I'm happy, as always, to introduce my friend and colleague, Eitan Kensky, the Reinhardt Curator of Hebraica and Judaica at Stanford Libraries. This film series is his initiative and has been a brilliant way during an impossible time to revisit well-known classics and learn about hidden gems of Jewish film history through discussions like the one we'll have today. We also welcome Ruby Namdar, a writer whose novel The Ruined House won the Sapir Prize, Israel's most prestigious literary award. He currently teaches Jewish literature, focusing on biblical and Talmudic narrative. Ruby recently wrote a compelling article in the Jewish Review of Books about A Tale of Love and Darkness, and I encourage you to check that out following today's event. Next, we welcome Rokhl Kafrissen, a journalist and playwright also living in New York City. She's a regular contributor to Tablet magazine, among many other publications, and through her blog and social media presence, Rokhl is an advocate for and authority on Yiddish culture in America. She's also, I learned for this event, an attorney. Finally, we're fortunate to have Fania Oz-Salzberger zooming in from Israel. Fania is an Israeli historian and essayist and a professor at the University of Haifa. She's published dozens of articles and many books, including Jews and Words, which she co-authored with her father, Amos Oz, about whose work we'll be speaking today. Thank you to our panelists and to Eitan, our moderator, and to those of you who have joined us for this awesome discussion. And I invite Fania to take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this introduction. Let me just start my video. And I hope that you can all hear me well. I'm talking from my living room in Zichron Yaakov, Israel, where the night is darkening. And this is not a very easy time for my family, for the memory of my father, Amos Oz. This is a very good reason for me to be happy to be here. And I thank both hosting institutes for their kind invitation. When Natalie Portman first came to my father's home in the desert to suggest that a film be made of A Tale of Love and Darkness, they spent hours talking away. And they kept spending hours meeting and talking away throughout the filming of A Tale of Love and Darkness, Natalie's film, on the different sets. I was there several times. I visited one of the sets. So I could watch this transformation of text to film at a fairly close range. It was fascinating. I've seen my father's books being made into movies before, but this was something unique. I think that Natalie Portman, by her own testimony, felt unusually, almost uncannily close to the figure of my grandmother Fania Klausner. They were physically quite alike. My father was pretty amazed when he saw Natalie in the flesh for the first time. The pictures do not show it, but she was something of a relative of my late grandmother's in terms of appearance and grace and a certain subdued, I would almost say East European charm about her. And my father was delighted by this closeness and then went on to tell Natalie something he told each and every film or theater director or producer who ever made an adaptation of any of my father's books. He simply said, from now on, this is your creation, Yetzirah in Hebrew. This is your work, this is your art. Go ahead and do it. I will not disturb, I'm around to help or to advise, and I will not tell you what to do. And he did not. I think that Natalie's film, which I love, came out very differently in many ways, in its tone, in its music, in its temperature from the book itself. I love them both. I love the book more, but Natalie's film picked out very delicately one or two threads, major threads, but not the only threads, from the book, From a Tale of Love and Darkness. The threads that Natalie chose to pick was the story of the mother and child. The sad tale of the mother and child, herself cast as the mother, a wonderful Israeli young actor as the child. Maybe there were a couple of other threads, the poverty and fear in Jerusalem, in those crowded neighborhoods under the Jordanian cannons on the eve of the War of Independence, or the Nakba. That too shows in the film beautifully. She managed, and her camera team managed, to streamline a gentle, delicate, historical Jerusalem without going through the works of big historical sets. It was just there. She got it. It was beautiful. Also herself as Fania, the mother. My father kept wiping his eyes when he watched it on the set, and then when we kept watching it again and again at home, he would wipe his eyes and say, yes, even the movements, even the body language are similar. I don't have much time, so I will quickly say what I think the film did not take from the book, maybe could not have taken from the book. The book is very multi-layered. It encompasses several different literary genres. It goes from low to high and from funny to tragic very quickly. Two major elements in the book were not represented in the film by Natalie's own choice, I think. The first is the intellectual context of it all. Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, the BBC reporting on international politics, the parties, the political arguments in the queue waiting for the grocer. The whole political setup, which was also an intellectual setup, an analysis of the Zionism, of his parents' Zionism, of right-wing nationalist but humanist Zionism. All this is not there. It is crucially important, especially today. It does not detract from the film, but I think it adds tremendously to the book. Finally, the second item, which is imbued in the novel, but non-existent in the film, is my father's wry sense of humor all over the place, making some of the saddest scenes, some of the most horrific scenes, some of the most dismal moments into almost side-splitting funny dialogues. funny dialogues. The gentle sense of humor, not in his dialogues, but also in his description of people, of men, women, children, street, neighborhood, city, era. All this Oz humor, the subtle and the side-splitting, is not in the film. It is not a humorous film in any way. And this is the one thing I would have liked, Natalie, to sprinkle around. Tragedy can never be solely a tragedy if it is sprinkled by gentle humor. This is true for those days. This is true for the length of my late father's life. And it is also true for today. Not only books, not only historical novels, but I think also wonderful literary and historical films need a tiny bit of salt, of gentle humor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fania. This was, as always, amazing to listen to Fania, the depth and wisdom of what she just said. I actually want to take it from where Fania left it and speak about a certain inherent tragedy there is to rendering a great work of literature from medium to medium. That there is a certain certain tragic element to the greatest successes. And if it's not, and sometimes, you know, it's not such a great success, sometimes it's amazing success, but there's always a loss. And I think that Amos Oz and Bashevis Singer, whom we're also speaking about today, both knew how to savor the bittersweet. They both knew how to embrace the bittersweetness of tragedy and of the artistic endeavor. They both had a taste for that. That's one of the things that make them such wonderful artists. I would like to speak about these two amazing authors for a minute and the difference between them. I will focus a little more on Oz, of course, naturally, but I feel that there is, it's a very fertile comparison. It's an interesting juxtaposition of the work of these two men, and I'm using this word, and then the work of the two women who worked with the work of these two men. There's actually a world of difference between Oz and Bashevis, in spite of the fact that they're both prominent Jewish authors of the 20th century, some of the most important. And I think that this difference is perhaps the reason for the big difference between the two films. While Bashevis is one of the most plot-driven authors I've ever read, his dialogues are wonderful. His wit is out of this world, but the plot is constantly on the move. Bashevis Singer wrote for the newspapers. He was a fast storyteller, telling stories in installment. He was like a Jewish Yiddish Shahrazad, surviving from chapter to chapter of the popular story he told in the newspaper. Amos Oz was the exact opposite. Amos Oz wrote high art. It was high literature. It was Belterist. It was not, I would say that for him, at times, and this is where I feel that I'm a direct disciple of Amos Oz, that the plot is sometimes an excuse to tell a story. When I teach literature, or in the rare occasions where I teach writing, I love to make this distinction to my students who are sometimes shocked by this very simple understanding. What is a plot and what's a story? A plot is a sequence of events. This happened, he did this, she did that, he took this, he shot her, she shot him back. Story is everything else. Amos Oz is the master of the story. Okay, sometimes there's very little plot, but there's a world of story, meaning, thinking, memory, okay? And above all, with Oz, language. He was the master of the Hebrew language. After Agnon, we did not have another Agnon but Oz, the master of the Hebrew. And these are the things that really make the work of Amos Oz so important and so immortal. And these are the things that, by definition, will not pass through a film. Regardless of the fact that the film, of course, was, you know, it was an impressive film and done well and got whatever recognition it did. But the tragedy was really inherent in the sense that the book, A Tale of Love and Darkness, exactly as Fania said, is so saturated with story, but it's the actual plot is somewhat thin in the way that Natalie Portman took this plot. The same plot, by the way, with an artistic switch, appears in two very important works of Amos Oz's earlier works. One is the book that made him perhaps the superstar of Hebrew literature, which is My Michael, which is a deeply melancholy, super sensitive story about a mother, father, and son in Jerusalem, in the same neighborhood where I grew up, Kerem Avraham, in Jerusalem. That is a little earlier when the city that I grew up in. And the whole, the like melancholy of parenthood, the solitude that comes with it, that burden of the city that this one woman carries on her shoulders. A similar theme is masterfully executed in a novella that for me is one of the heights of Hebrew literature or world literature, The Hill of Evil Counsel by Amos Oz, where he describes, this time they move from Kerem Avraham to Tel Arza, which is like 2 streets down towards the west, same neighborhood. A wonderful, wonderful novella about a single child of highly intellectual and neurotic parents, the chaos surrounding them, the fear, the burden of these mountains, of the rocks of Jerusalem, all of that. So clearly Oz told this story a few times in his life. It was his foundation story. And this is what Portman took and created the work with. It's like removing a certain element of the large work, but very little of the rest of the stuff traveled. So the tragedy is that whenever there's a good book that we read, we feel it became part of us. We feel like we own it. And if somebody dares, so to speak, to come and make it theirs, like Natalie Portman did with A Tale of Love and Darkness, everybody is constantly going to point out to what she missed in their tale of love and darkness, because the reader felt so involved already. This is not what happened with Yentl, because Yentl was not such a famous story. Yentl became famous because of the film. Singer was well known, but this particular story was not, it wasn't such a big a deal already. So actually the film put him on the map in this way. And so it was a reversal of the roles here, where the film kind of discovered the book. There is also something to be said about the difference between the Hebrew and the Yiddish, which I may save for the discussion, but like the Hebrew carries with it a different sense of gravitas and a different sense of tragedy than the Yiddish does. And of course, as an Israeli, I'm on the side of Hebrew, but it is a conversation. It is not necessarily a very quiet conversation, an argument between the Hebrew and the Yiddish over what captures Jewish literature. And I feel that the work of these two authors could not be more different because of this, also the medium of the language. Finally, there's a point that I want to touch very briefly, is the fact that these two men wrote some of the most amazing women that we read. Okay, Amos Oz wrote Chana Gonen in Michael Sheli, who is really his mother, I guess, definitely very close, definitely working with that character. He wrote the mother in A Tale of Love and Darkness and the mother in The Hill of Evil Counsel. And he did, I think, an amazing job. I think that there was the channeling of the other gender was amazing. And I think that it is shocking also to see how well Bashevis Singer did it from another side. A man who loved women very much in all kinds of ways. Singer was a very, very spirited womanizer and loved women. It's very interesting how he identified perhaps even with Yentl. And I think that there is, and with this I will end, that then the two younger women came and took the men's work and made it theirs again. So, and I don't feel that it's a struggle. I feel that it's a collaboration. I know for sure that Oz and Portman worked very well together, that it was a lovely collaboration between them. It doesn't have to be a conflict. And I feel that with this, I will end that we are now living in a time where every time you assume the narrative of someone who's not exactly you, there's a whole guard of guardians of culture who's going to come and say, you cannot do that. You may not speak in the female voice. You may not speak in this voice, and you may not speak in that voice. But lo and behold, some of the most amazing female characters created by Oz and Bashevis Singer. And I think it's wonderful. I think art and literature are meant to expand human imagination and connection and you know, bypass these boundaries, the social boundaries, not to be trapped in them. Thank you very much.
Yentl was the film adaptation of a Bashevis short story called Yentl, the Yeshiva Boy. And it was in development for many, many years before it became Barbra Streisand's directorial debut in 1983. It was filmed in what was then Czechoslovakia, which was standing in for Poland, and some additional shooting in England. And though we naturally tend to focus on the love triangle of Barbra Streisand, Mandy Patinkin, and Amy Irving, the entire cast is superb. The film itself is gorgeous. The pacing is leisurely, but confident, never drags. I saw Yentl around the time it came out on home video, probably in 1985 or so, and 10-year-old me did not really get it. Yentl is very much a movie for adults, especially adult women. I didn't see the movie again until just a few years ago. I was blown away by how much I loved it. Even the fussy Yiddishist in me didn't have much to complain about. Surprising. Here's the thing. There are a couple big barriers to enjoying this movie. First, it's a movie musical, and a very particular kind of movie musical. If you don't like movie musicals, you're going to have a hard time enjoying Yentl. Second, you have to accept the total Barbara-ness or the Barbara-kite of the thing, you might say in Yiddish. In my opinion, Yentl the movie is less an adaptation of a short story than it is the product of a unique American cinematic auteur. And that's something we're not used to seeing from female artists. Third, Isaac Bashevis Singer famously hated the movie adaptation of his story. Though I do completely agree with one of his criticisms, which I hope we'll get to a little bit later. If you ask me, talking about what the movie got right or wrong is, in general, not a productive way to think about Yentl, the movie. I'd remind you that Stephen King hated Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining, which I think most of us will agree is really an American classic. In fact, there's an interesting comparison to make between Kubrick and Barbra Streisand, two well-known and perhaps exasperating perfectionist director auteurs. I'd argue that what makes Yentl so great is not how accurately it portrays turn-of-the-century yeshiva life in Poland, nor how well it translates Bashevis' story to the screen. It is really its own original English language text. It's its own thing, it's sui generis. The movie offers us a fascinating vision of a female director using a male-authored story to explore the fluidity and the limits of gender. In Bashevis' story, for example, the romance between Anshel and Avigdor, and it is very much a romance, is just as important as that between Avigdor and Hadass, and Barbra Streisand, the director, captures that beautifully. Relatedly, where the Hollywood cinematic tradition has a built-in tendency toward the male gaze and the use of the camera to objectify female actors on screen, in Yentl, the gaze of the camera is far more subtle. On many levels, we are aware of a female director looking at herself as well as other women and men. We also see how differently she uses the camera to look at Avigdor, the male romantic lead, versus the way she uses the camera to shoot Hadass, the female love object. If anyone is objectified in Yentl, it is Mandy Patinkin as Avigdor, not Amy Irving as Hadass. Also, so interesting that in the story, Hadass's blondness is important, if not pivotal, to Avigdor's devotion to her. Streisand dispenses entirely with this classic Hollywood visual cliche, the on-screen shorthand for desirable woman, the love object as blonde. So I think that we have to kind of look at the movie as its own thing, as an English language text, as the product of an American director, and especially a woman director. And we have to think about it on its own terms. At the same time, I do have a couple of critiques of Yentl, which actually are similar to my critique of A Tale of Love and Darkness, which I loved. And I hope we're going to have time to get to that too.
Thank you very much. I'd invite all the other panelists to unmute and resume video so that we can have a broader discussion of these two films. So since this came up first, allow me to say thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about these movies, these directors, and by implication, the original texts with such a learned panel, most of whom are in New York. So thank you very much for agreeing to appear here. Now, I want to open this conversation by talking about something that just came up in one of the earlier presentations, which is what connects it to the broader theme of our film series, Jewish women filmmakers. As Ruby said, both of these source texts are written by men about women. And what we have here are the reinterpretation of that by women filmmakers. So my question to the group is, how do we see this playing out on screen and in the final work? Do we feel like it actually has an impact on what we perceive? What happens in this kind of transition from the male pen to the female gaze, or as Rokhl suggested, a gaze that is maybe more indeterminate and neutral? Yentl maybe enacts some of these reversals, but they're obviously there and present in both films.
Well, I'd like to talk about something which I think is really interesting that I think both filmmakers do. And on the one hand, maybe people won't like me ascribing this to their gender. They might find it too reductive, but I think it's too tantalizing to not talk about, which is that, well, first of all, if you listen to Barbra Streisand's director's commentary on Yentl, which I just did, there may be various reasons why she talks about the things that she does, but you can't help but notice that she watches it as a director and a producer. So she's very focused on the look of the movie. She's very focused on the colors. You know, she notices, oh, she'll say, I love pink and beige. And she said, and that building was actually pink. So the look of it was very, very important. The colors were very important to her. There's a sort of aestheticization of the text and the story, which I see as being very much a product of her being a woman. Again, I know people are going to say I'm being too reductive, but you definitely get the sense that the way it looks is very Streisand-esque. I mean, she has her own aesthetic overall, if you know who she is. And I think that also extends to, there's a certain gentleness to the film, which strikes you as strange once you think about it, that there's basically no non-Jews in the film, and there's no threat of non-Jewish violence. I mean, it's also not in the story, but it's to an extent where it almost feels a little bit like a fairy tale. It feels very gentle. It is very much its own world. And in A Tale of Love and Darkness, I thought it was so interesting, Fania, that you brought up that, you know, the humorous aspects of the book are missing. That kind of dynamic range of registers is missing. And I feel like what Natalie did as a director was almost going too far in terms of telling a serious story and coming up with this color palette for the movie and, you know, having this certain vision that she kind of lost sight of that range, so that in both movies you almost have this, they're teetering on the precipice of being too aestheticized. They're too beautiful. They look a certain way. They do a certain thing. And I think it's really interesting. I think it relates to them being conscious of being women behind the camera, if that makes sense.
Yes, maybe I can add here. I agree with you. And I think that what Portman did, she feminized A Tale of Love and Darkness in a particular way. I think that Natalie was very much into the business of motherhood when she was shooting this film. She brought Alf with her over to my parents' home in Tel Aviv for them to maybe even babysit him a little bit. They fell in love with him. She was very much in a state of her own early motherhood. And I think that she was initially drawn by the tragedy of motherhood. In the book itself, this was the thread, the main thread that I mentioned, her pulling out of that great complex labyrinth of a novel. She cast herself rightly and delicately as a very fragile young mother in a very fragile and strange world. The world is becoming more and more ominous, while her own motherhood, which is so dear to her, and her own child, who is so dear to her, are receding into some kind of a twilight zone. So this is a kind of a classic feminization of a story that was initially, I think, far more masculine, my father's story, with the Ben-Gurions and the Begins and the war and the politics. And of course, his father, even though he's played in the film by the wonderful Gilad Kahana, who spends the rest of his time being a leader of an excellent rock group. The father does not get the voice that he gets in the book. My grandfather Aryeh, the scholarly, learned, perhaps a little cold, extremely verbal academic, is not really there. A few heart-rending stories about him are there, but he's not really there. So I'll just maybe end up by saying the following. It's not about more verbal or less verbal. It's about two different kinds of verbality. The female, Natalie's, and the male, Amos's, and Aryeh's, his father's. I just want to add in the footnote that some of us women happen to be verbal also in the academic and cerebral way. And perhaps if a woman like this would make the film again, she would make it in a way that is intellectually closer to those aspects that Natalie Portman left out. And this is absolutely doable, I hasten to add.
Can I add one more thing about the idea of the woman's eye behind the camera? You know, I can only imagine or maybe dream about what it must be like to be Natalie Portman, who is truly one of the most beautiful women in Hollywood, if not in the world. I mean, she's just stunning. So imagine being her, both the, you know, as an actor, but also her being a director, shooting herself. And it's so interesting that we end up with this movie where she is beautiful in the movie. There's no question. She's not, they don't try to make her look less attractive, but the camera does not do the things we normally expect it to do when presented with such an exquisitely gorgeous woman. It doesn't linger on her face in the same way. It doesn't isolate her. We're not invited to gaze at her in the way that I think we might normally do. And I think that's so fascinating. And I would love to know or find out a little bit about her choices regarding that, regarding shooting herself. And, you know, at this point, she's an adult, she's a mother. Having grown up in front of the camera, how did she feel about shooting herself and reproducing, you know, her female image on screen?
Maybe there's another way to kind of phrase that question and to think about it. You know, you talked about Yentl as this exercise in Barbarkeit, which I love. I'm going to have to start thinking about more often. These are both incredibly famous women who are making these movies almost at the height of their fame. And I'm wondering if we can see this struggle with celebrity and what it means kind of playing out within the film. Celebrity obviously gets the films made, and celebrity is why you can make an adaptation of A Tale of Love and Darkness in Hebrew. But there seems to be something going on of a self-reflection beyond that. You know, Natalie Portman's Fania is like an ethereal creature whose inner life is unknown to the audience and to the child, which is to say it's something like our relationship to actual celebrities. And Yentl is almost a fantasy of disappearing and living a normal life. So what does it mean that these movies are not just made by women filmmakers, but by actresses who are playing kind of signature roles? And how does it complicate our understandings of the film? And Ruby, we'll start with you.
I would love to say something that you actually stole. Thank you, Eitan. You stole my brilliant... I think that there's no struggle with celebrity here. There's a celebration of celebrity. I actually think that I speak as an artist myself, so I can say it. Behind every serious work of art, there's a great sense of hubris. Without hubris, you will never be an artist. And hubris is a good thing when it comes to art. But there's also hubris and hubris. And I think that there's, in both films, there's definitely a very strong sense of, I don't want to use the word entitlement, but I will use it. There is a certain sense of entitlement of women who are famous, powerful, who covet a certain role because it projects on them something that they want, they crave, and they use their power. Now, this is great. I mean, this is how Hollywood is, that's how the art world works. But I don't see a struggle with celebrity. I actually see using the celebrity to take something that they really want and make it theirs and focus the camera on them and make it about them, really. These are two films in which the women who made them are very present. The camera is on them. Now, Rokhl, I mean, that you said before about women, I know that usually I think men are more, traditionally men are more comfortable doing this, and because we're schmucks, you know, self-centered schmucks. And here we have two women who are behaving like male schmucks, you know. It's like, okay, shut up everyone, camera on me now, I'm telling the story. Exactly. And I think that's somewhere between disturbing and refreshing. I think the strength of both films is due to that, but also the weaknesses, and there are weaknesses in both films.
Absolutely.
And I think it's fascinating that Bashevis hated the film while Oz loved it. It's a mystery to me. It's fascinating. I would expect the other, actually.
I want to speak to another transformation that happened between text and screen in a way that, even though I don't think, you know, it's helpful to keep track of what Streisand did right or wrong. It's not about that exactly, but I think that this really kind of gets at what she was doing in a way that I think kind of didn't serve the text, which is that, if I may do a tiny little bit of textual comparison, if you look at the Yiddish from Yentl the Yeshiva Boy, the story, the way Bashevis describes the wedding night, he says that he uses the verb behaften, which means to overtake something or someone, meaning that he describes Anshul taking Hadassah's virginity. And in fact, he uses the verb überzureisen, wir soll überzureisen bei Hadassen die Besulen. So, you know, he found a way, hat gefunden a Vorteil, wir soll überzureisen bei Hadassen die Besulen. So, you know, he did it. However, if you'll recall in the movie, what happens on the wedding night in the scene, Anshul says, okay, we're going to all get tipsy. You know, we're going to have a pillow fight. And Anshul pours a little bit of wine on the mattress very deliberately, thinking ahead, like, okay, we're going to, you know, cover our bases here so nobody asks questions. And to me, it's an excision of a really important bit of, frankly, life and violence. Like, I think taking that out and putting in a pillow fight does not serve the story in the slightest, but I can understand why, as a woman making a film about women, you would even maybe subconsciously look to soften or not reproduce yet again another bit of violence against women, which I think any woman who makes movies is probably really conscious of seeing and not wanting to see.
Actually, maybe we can stay in that scene for a moment. That is one of the major transformations from the original source text into the movie, is just how much Anshul's character is to some extent softened. That Anshul is a much more aggressive about what they're doing. That Anshul in the story has this plan to do it. It's less accidental. It's less tied into love for Avigdor. So, and that's, love is really a key theme here, and it's a key difference between the movie and the story. And it's a complicated one. I mean, the major change by Streisand and Jack Rosenthal is that Hadass falls for Anshul because of the way that Anshul treats her as a kind of partner, as an equal. And it seems to be saying, you know, that it seems to be a critique of the whole gender system and romance and of its time, and also the time when the movie is being made, that a true partnership would actually only be possible with someone of the same gender, because they're the ones who would treat you the way you actually want to be treated. So I'm responding to this as a question about Yentl, but I think romantic love is also at issue in A Tale of Love and Darkness. And I think that maybe we could also address what role romantic love is serving in these stories, and how, whether or not it's possible, and, you know, its place within a Jewish society, and what it meant, what it might have meant at that moment in time.
Maybe you can see I raised my hand. I wanted to say something about those male novelists, not just vis-a-vis their female directors, film directors, but they also have something else in common. Both Bashevis Singer and Amos Oz had a powerfully literary mother. So did Marcel Proust. So did any number of other Jewish writers. And if you remember reading Bashevis Singer's In the Court of My Father, or In My Father's Court of Law, It's the mother that has this little bookshelf in the kitchen of general European literature that makes the young Bashevis Singer thrive. His father only has Talmudic books. In my father's case, it's his mother who brought him the dark tales of the steppes of the Ukraine and the forests of Russia, not his father. So it's more dialectic than we have said so far, in the sense that each of these very male, very masculine in many ways, novelists gleaned more poetry, more literature from his respective mother than from his father. And maybe this is what can make writers like Bashevis Singer and Amos Oz more malleable for female artists adapting them into film or theater. I don't think it's the same with Philip Roth, for example. So we are talking about a kind of a 3-generation gender dialectic, which is a bit more complicated than just a male writer and a female movie director.
Fania, I've been alerted via direct message that you also have a photo that you would like to share.
Yes, I do. Okay, so what you see here is a picture I took myself. Can't remember the exact year. It was the winter when Natalie was filming most of A Tale of Love and Darkness in Jerusalem. They found an old apartment. They bought old books by the meter. I came with my dad for a visit. My father was astonished by the size of the set. He said my own apartment was more or less the size of the main camera, and the house looked so big to him. However, when he stepped between his cinematic parents, Natalie and Gilad Kahana, suddenly he became a little child again. And look at him here. And look at them, what this must have meant for them. Suddenly the young people are his parents. This is, I can testify, this is what happens to every child of an older parent at a certain point. But the actors are now suddenly becoming the parents of the novelists in a way that I think might be relatively new to the history of relations between books and films. And that's why I find this picture so very touching.
Great, thank you for sharing. Ruby, do you have anything to add to the romance, love story in either or both texts?
I actually would, because I think that one of the striking things about the two films, and I think that when Rokhl brought up the pillow fight, yes, it's is that unlike the real ability of these two authors to touch on eroticism in a very deep and at times harsh way, in these two works, and I think this element is softened. Seriously, I felt that Portman's film was devoid of all eroticism. I didn't feel any erotic tension at all. I feel like, as Fania said, maybe she was so overcome by the sense of motherhood and the tragedy of motherhood that it really became devoid of all eroticism. Now, anyone who knows the writing of Amos Oz knows that there's always eros, nachon Fania? There's like a strong presence of eros in its like deeper sense of there's always like the full gamut of the human experience, from the erotic to the cerebral, is always there in every sentence. And this is where it seems like she might have walked on eggshells, not wanting to infuse it with any of this, or she just wasn't ready to touch it in any way. To make Bashevis Singer less erotic is really a challenge, because, you know, he was like a really erotic little imp, you know, and then it's lovely. And of course, there's a little more sexuality in Yentl. But again, like you pointed out so well, Rokhl, it remains innocent. It remains childish. It does not become really at any point the real thing. And that's, I think, very interesting. And maybe this is because these two women wanted, like, I'm going to use it in a very ironic way, a pure work. They were not willing to go to that corner. What do you think, Rokhl?
I think it's possible. Again, it's frustrating when you watch the director's commentary because Barbara seems so reluctant to really engage with the text. And I'm not sure why. But yeah, I mean, the story certainly raises questions about like what was going on in Yentl's pants or Anshul's pants, like, you know, the getting measured at the tailor, it's in there. And you know, okay, I want to go a little bit further here and say that the criticism that I shared with Bashevis of the movie is that at the end of the movie, Yentl leaves and says, you know, you and Avigdor and Hadass, you're going to get married. I'm going to go off somewhere, right? And then you see Yentl/Anshul on the boat, presumably headed to the United States. The music swells. Barbara sings a song, and we're supposed to understand that somehow what's been implied is that Yentl is now heading to a land where he can be free to study Talmud and, you know, really fulfill his potential, which is so patently absurd as to like just, it really passes the pillow fight. And Bashevis really hated that part. I mean, he really ripped into it, and there I agreed with him. And to go back to what you said, Eitan, and I think you're right that it might almost be subconscious on Barbara's part, who can say, except her, but there's this feeling that she can't square the circle, right? Like if you can only truly have equality between partners, between people who are the same sex because they understand how to treat each other, then there is no way to square that circle. And so the only solution is to like kind of get on this fantasy boat and pretend like things are going to be better somewhere else. That's Barbara's solution. Whereas in the story, the very last paragraph says, not long after the wedding, Hadass became pregnant. The child was a boy, and those assembled at the circumcision could scarcely believe their ears when they heard the father name his son Anshul. So, you know, the implication is that Anshul is dead. That's, right. You know, that we cannot overcome these gender boundaries. We cannot be more than what we are. We cannot find love where people say you may not find love. And, you know, that's the end of the story. Anshul was dead.
So I think that this is to use a modern term, this is an extremely thirsty movie. There's a lot of kind of longing looks at each other, moments when Anshul is very much sexually falling for Hadass, moments when the dinner after they're all married, everyone is really desirous of each other in a way that cannot be acknowledged without completely going away from the source text. And it leads to some very interesting things. But I know Fania has to leave in a minute, so I want to ask one last question to everyone, which is to go back and just kind of look at like another kind of very obvious but very salient feature of these movies, and that's language. So A Tale of Love and Darkness is a multilingual film with Hebrew, English, Polish, and Arabic all represented, and language acquisition and etymology and love of Hebrew even figures in the film, kind of as a subject. Yet it's made by an American actress who, although she was raised knowing some learning Hebrew, was an international presence and an international movie star. Yentl, the film, takes place in English, but the languages would presumably be Yiddish and Rabbinic Hebrew and Aramaic, or what we would have called Lashon Kodesh. So I'd like to start by asking everyone to reflect not only on what is lost, but maybe what is also gained by these linguistic choices. Why English? Why Hebrew? Why not Yiddish? And Fania, why don't we start with you, since I know you have a hard out.
Yes, well, Natalie Portman did a great thing. She was one of the, I think it makes her into one of the most thorough actor researcher in the history of film at all. She came over to Israel on and off for almost a year, studying Hebrew very studiously. And that was very tricky because she needed to study modern Hebrew, but to become aware of the kind of less modern Hebrew that was spoken with a Polish or Russian accent, German accent in Jerusalem in the 1930s and 40s. This is a double trick. And I happened to meet on the set in Jerusalem her Hebrew tutor, one of her Hebrew tutors, also a great actress in her own right, Netta Riskin, who plays Yentl in Shtisel, if anybody is aware of that unbelievably excellent protagonist of Shtisel. And in A Tale of Love and Darkness, Netta Riskin played my great aunt Chaya, Fania's older sister. She was both a friend and a guide to Natalie, and Netta told me, that Natalie had been unbelievably diligent in studying both current Hebrew. She didn't have to study it all. She had to refresh her childhood memories, and then also delving into that old-fashioned Polish Hebrew of Fania and her generation. I think this is absolutely amazing. I want to point out one last linguistic aspect, if I may. Not all of Amos's books, words, passages, sentences found themselves into the movie. This is natural. It's a huge volume and not a very long movie. However, the script, I think, left out a few things that could have easily have slipped in the beauty of some of his passages, of some of his sentences. And I can tell you that the first attempt at writing a script for Natalie's book, my father insisted on including my sister Galia, a poet, an editor, a filmmaker, as a member of the team, of the script writing team. Unfortunately, that round of the script did not work out. And in the second round, it was another professional scriptwriter. So fewer of the author's actual prose drizzled into the movie's script. And as you can imagine, I'm always for enhancing rather than diminishing the author's literary voice. I must say, because I'm ending, that I not only loved Natalie Portman's A Tale of Love and Darkness, I also love what you guys are doing here now. I'm grateful to the audience. I'm very grateful to Rokhl for teaching me so many things I didn't know about Yentl already. And I know that I can learn so much more. And to dear Ruby, an old friend, and to you, Eitan, Shayna, Sarah, Suzanne, Moment Magazine, the Toby Center, everyone involved. It's a rare pleasure for me these days to discuss such a beautiful aspect of my father's literature.
Thank you. So we will keep talking. Maybe we'll keep going with this question and then open it up to the audience. But I will also just put in a brief plug. When Natalie was a student at Harvard, she was a Hebrew student with my former colleague Irit Acharoni, who's terrific. So if anyone knows any Harvard undergrads or graduate students, tell them to take Hebrew with Irit. I could not fall asleep tonight if I didn't put in that plug and make sure that it was thrown out there. Okay, so we're on the question of language and both what is lost and gained in the way the films treat language.
I want to say a word about Yiddish and Hebrew in general, that these are in many ways polar opposite languages in the mood. And I want to speak about the mood. Rokhl and I love to banter about this because, you know, I am of the Hebrew. First of all, I mean, here in America, people say, oh, Hebrew and Yiddish, whatever, the Jewish languages. But because most of you are Ashkenazim, it's a fact. Like coming back from Israel, for example, half of us, Yiddish is not our heritage. It's not a Jewish language. We know some of it, but it's just not ours. So there's a very big split between how Yiddish is conceived here now as this kind of almost a subversive new way of being Jewish, bypassing perhaps the tyranny of the Hebrew, which was here for a while as the authentic Jewish language, and it's fascinating. I feel that Yentl, actually, the film missed the Yiddish mood. It had a Hollywood mood. You said it happens in English. It happens in English. It happens in American Hollywood English. And I'm not saying it fondly. I think it totally lost the mood of the Yiddish, that is this delicious, ironic, impish mood. And that is like, Bashevis is the incarnation of it, the embodiment of Yiddish, this deep sense of irony. There isn't an ironic second in Yentl, right? It's just devoid of all irony. Rokhl, do you see any Yiddish irony there at all?
No, yeah,
Oh, right.
you're right, yeah.
Yeah. Now, A Tale of Love and Darkness, also the film also took the Hebrew, and especially Amos Oz's Hebrew, is on the other end of the spectrum. The Hebrew takes itself very seriously. It's the language of kings and prophets and judges. It's this kind of, it was only recently awakened from its like 2,000 years slumber. It lives off of mythology. It's the exact opposite of Yiddish, which is a language of the ear, a language of the body, a language of the experience. Hebrew was very cerebral, came from above. And Oz was its unconditioned master of like the big Hebrew, the larger than life. And I feel that too was honestly lost in that film. I don't feel that, because of what Fania just said, that there was very little of the actual Oz text in the film. I feel that a lot was lost because of that grandness of the language. So paradoxically, the languages that were supposed to be the governing languages of the film were both not present. And I think it omitted some of the charm of the original books, because it did not travel into the cinema. And
so I'm going to ask Sarah to come up now, because we only have about 10 minutes left in the program, to ask some audience questions and whatever appeared in the Q&A. And I will just say, though, that I think that there is one major thing that's added by Yentl being in English, which is that the question of Jewish literacy, and that when everything is in English, the audience can participate in the kind of source discussion that they're having. And it becomes about, you know, the woman as an equal partner in the learning, and the woman maybe as a kind of, that it can be easily transmitted to someone else. And that is actually kind of a radical discussion of saying, this is why we need translation for this egalitarian, you know, approach.
That's a really important point.
Thank you. Thanks, Eitan. Well, this has been great. A bunch of people have been asking where they can see the films. So they're available on Amazon Prime to rent.
Tale of Love and Darkness is also currently on Netflix.
Okay. Shout out to Netflix. There's also been a few questions about kind of translating from literature to film in general. One from Jordan Hirsch, I think is really interesting. He asked, is it possible that Oz, being a generation and a half younger than Bashevis, was able to understand film as a medium separate from his own work, whereas Bashevis saw it as necessarily an extension of his own work?
I think that's an interesting point. And Bashevis was so intimately wrapped up in the process of translation. Translation was so key to who he was, his presence in American literature, American letters, that it's possible that if he saw the movie as simply a translation, yet another translation, and seeing the, you know, in that sense, the violence done to the text, I could understand him having, you know, this outsized reaction to it, and not understanding that movies are their own thing always, in any case. Yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, I know that he was very controlling of the translations. He was very, and it is hard. Look, it is hard to see your work become someone else's. I actually think it's more of a, it's more interesting that Oz liked Portman's work than that Bashevis hated Streisand. Because Oz too was very controlling, every word, everything is measured. And I cannot imagine that it was easy for him. And I cannot but imagine that there was a certain struggle, inner struggle to let go. That's in general, by the way, I feel that the book too, A Tale of Love and Darkness, had a certain letting go element in it that the rest of his work did not have. That's for a whole different discussion.
Are there any Amos Oz books that were made into films that you think did
I think I know that My Michael was turned into a film, and I believe it was. Am I making this up? No, I'm not an expert, but I believe it was.
And while we're on A Tale of Love and Darkness, someone wanted to know, how do you think Natalie Portman's perspective as a primarily diasporic Jew shaped her reading of the text? And maybe we can also talk about how, you know, Barbara as kind of an American-born Jew maybe, you know, interpreted Yentl a little differently also.
I think Rokhl should speak, and then I'm going to steal her best ideas.
Well, I mean, look, putting Yentl on, or Anshul on that ship at the end, going to America, I mean, can you find anywhere in cinema such an American Jewish point of view of America as the solution to all of the Jews, you know, thousands of years of problems?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a statement of diasporic pride, if there ever was one.
It's also, it kind of reminds me of the end of Fiddler on the Roof, right? Where they're like, we'll go to America. That's it.
Although that's in the text. That is in the text. That they do.
Yeah, that is in the text.
Yeah, but it's not in. Yeah, it's not in Bashevis's text.
I think that unlike what even Oz thought about his book, A Tale of Love and Darkness, which he thought would interest like a very small group of people who actually shared his experiences, and was stunned by the international sweeping success of this book. He says, of all my books, this is the one you like? And it is stunning because it's so particular. It's about like a walk. Again, I'm a Jerusalemite and Yerushalmi, so I know the streets. And like this store and that stone and this building, but like, why would, you know, it was a huge bestseller in China. He's like, why? But he didn't argue, but he was surprised. So I actually think that Portman saw the universal element in this. And I think that in spite of the fact that there's some local color, the real drama of A Tale of Love and Darkness is not about Israel, is not about local color. It's about the human condition and family and the female condition. And I think she spotted this. And that's why the fact that she's a diaspora Jew maybe helped her not be stuck in the Israeli angle, but see the universal value of this story.
It's also interesting that both, you know, Natalie Portman and Barbara Streisand, like these were their kind of passion projects, or, you know, some people would call vanity projects. And it took them a really long time to get them funded. And, you know, perhaps it's because they were women or, you know, something else, but, you know, they sort of championed, you know, these projects when they could have gone on to something else. Oh, so
one of the ways that really plays out, by the way, in Yentl is just the song. I mean, Rokhl started to say that you might not like this movie if you don't like musicals, and this is a very particular kind of musical, and that is true. I mean, the music is there for the inner monologue of the character, and sometimes the music is giving us the gender play that we'll see Anshul, and the music will keep saying he, and so we get that this character kind of played out that way. But that was the key to actually getting this movie made. It was the Barbara knowing that Barbara singing was going to unlock the money, that there's a kind of early attempt at making Yentl in short film form that's like a 16mm art movie that was never going to get made by a major studio. Mm-hmm. But if you throw in, Papa, Can You Hear Me? And a big number on a boat at the end, a showboat, if you will, you could get this made.
And I want to say two things about the movie, about the music, which is that in the director's commentary, she tells the story of being 18 and working at the Bonsoir Club. I guess it was a club in New York where she was singing. And that's where she met Alan and Marilyn Bergman, who became her lifelong songwriting partners. And according to Barbara, Marilyn walks into the dressing room and says to 18-year-old Barbara, "Do you know how wonderful you are?" Can you imagine? So this movie gets made when, Barbara is playing, she's 41 in this movie, and she's playing somebody who's really supposed to be in their late teens, early 20s. But she has been working with the Bergmans for all those decades as an artist. And I think that, again, it's part of her integrale Barbarkeit, right? Her integrated Barbara-ness, that she transcends any character she plays. So of course the Bergmans are going to write her music. And I think, in a way, speaking to this point of language, that was a good thing, because if they had kind of mixed it up and done some like pastiche of Yiddish songs, it would have been, it would have been so cringy and probably terrible, but better that they just let Barbara be Barbara. Let it be exactly what it was. The songs were, kind of corny and they're in English and they're a certain genre that moms love. Sorry. And that's good. And that's why I think it works, because it is what it is. It knows what it is,
Definitely knows what it is, yeah.
So actually someone asked if this film would work as a drama instead of a musical.
I think so. It could, but would it have as big an audience? Maybe not.
I do think the movie is kind of advancing an argument of, you don't need my songs for me to make it a good movie. That Barbara is kind of saying, you can tell that she knows how to make a movie, how to structure a film, how to compose shots, and that at certain points the songs are kind of interruptions. So it's not surprising that this is the only musical, that she directed. That once she's established that she can make movies, then she can just tell more of the stories she wants to tell.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So it looks like we're actually out of time. One last question to Ruby. Someone asked, is The Ruined House going to be a film?
I would love that. Are there directors in the house?
Anyone listening?
I would love that. I thought in cinema is a huge source of inspiration for me, very big. And I sometimes, when I speak about this book, The Ruined House, I say in Hebrew, it's easier, Sefer Seret, it pops out of my mouth, the film, Haseret. I already see it, so hopefully one day.
Well, thank you. Thanks to all of you. This has been great. Moment will send some links later with some articles and, Ruby's book, and Rokhl, I know you have something. You actually have another event tonight.
Yes.
That you're
totally different one. Very different.
I don't know if you want to give that a little shout out.
So at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, I'm going to be moderating an event for the Museum of Jewish Heritage here in New York on Heroines of the Holocaust, which it focuses on the role of women in Jewish partisan units and other forms of resistance. So if you're interested, I think it's going to be a really wonderful program.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks to Eitan and Shayna. And you guys should tune in next week, where Vered Gutman is going to make all different charosets from all over the world.
And we'll be announcing our spring programming slate for Rewind pretty soon.